The day I sat across from my sister in that boardroom, I didn't bring a lawyer. I didn't bring witnesses. I brought a binder. Isabella had rented the conference room herself. Nameplates, water glasses, a projector showing her development company's timeline. She'd even brought our parents, seated behind her like a corporate board. She looked at me the way she always did, like I was the building manager, like I was the help. Is this really necessary, Elena? I placed the binder on the table. To understand why I was the calmest person in that room, you need to understand what my grandmother built and what my sister tried to destroy. Her name was Rose Nguyen. She came to Chicago in 1987 with a suitcase, $200, and handwriting so precise it looked like it belonged in a museum. She bought a run-down 18-unit apartment building on the south side when nobody else wanted it. Paid $74,000 cash. Every dollar earned from 12 years of alterations work, hemming suits for men who never learned her name. I remember her kitchen. The yellow tiles she'd scrubbed so many times, the glaze had worn thin in spots. The smell of lemongrass and something baking. She'd sit at the table with her ledger, a real one, leather-bound, pages filled with that perfect handwriting, and she'd track every rent payment, every repair, every dollar in and out of the building. "This building is not property, Elena," she told me once. I was 11. She pressed her pen against the page so the ink bled a little deeper. "This building is a promise." I didn't understand then. I do now. By the time I took over as building manager at 32, I knew every unit by heart. Unit 4B, Mrs. Alvarez, 71. She'd lived there since 1994 and kept a garden on her windowsill, basil, cilantro, and a single stubborn orchid that somehow survived every Chicago winter. She paid $1,100 a month and never missed a payment, not once in 28 years. Unit 7A, Mr. Novak, retired electrician. He fixed the hallway lights for free because, as he put it, Rose gave me a place when nobody else would. He kept a photo of his late wife on his door. Every Christmas, he left a box of pierogies outside my office. Unit 12C, the Kim family, parents and 2 teenagers. Mr. Kim drove a delivery truck 6 days a week. Mrs. Kim worked nights at a packaging plant. Their daughter, Ji-yeon, had just been accepted to DePaul on a partial scholarship. They paid $1,350 and split it across 2 paychecks. Unit 3A, Sarah Chen, 39, forensic accountant. Quiet. The kind of quiet where you could feel the calculations happening behind her eyes. She'd moved in 2 years ago and paid on time every time, and never asked for anything except that the lobby door lock actually work. These weren't tenants. They were the building. They were what my grandmother's promise looked like, 35 years later. What none of them knew, what nobody knew, was that I owned it. My grandmother had set up an LLC before she passed, Ross Legacy Holdings. She'd put my name on everything, the deed, the operating agreement, the bank accounts. Elias Thorne, her attorney for 15 years, had walked me through the paperwork when I was 28. I'd signed documents I barely understood at a desk that smelled like old leather and coffee. "Your grandmother wanted this building protected," Elias had said. He'd pushed his glasses up and looked at me like he was delivering something fragile. "She wanted it protected from family." I didn't ask what he meant. Not then. For 4 years, I managed the building as if I were just the manager. I collected rent, I called plumbers, I replaced smoke detectors. I kept my grandmother's ledger updated in the same precise handwriting she'd taught me, sitting at that yellow-tiled kitchen table. My sister Isabella didn't know any of this. Isabella was 2 years younger and 10 years more confident. Business degree from Northwestern, tailored blazer, even on weekends. She worked in commercial real estate development. Acquisitions, she called it, which mostly meant convincing people to sell things they loved. She was good at it. She had a gift for making you feel like saying yes was your idea. Our parents adored her. When Isabella landed the Northwestern scholarship, they threw a dinner party. When I got promoted to senior manager at the building, Mom said, "That's nice, honey. Can you pass the salad?" Isabella visited the building once, maybe twice a year. She'd walk through the lobby in heels that clicked too loud against my grandmother's tile floors, glance around like she was appraising inventory, and leave. She never asked about Mrs. Alvarez's orchid. She never tasted Mr. Novak's pierogies. She never knew Gion's name, but she knew the building's address, and she knew what the land was worth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I found it taped to the lobby door. Not mailed, not slipped under, taped. Like an eviction notice at a motel. Printed on Isabella's company letterhead. Urban Horizon Development Partners. Effective immediately, monthly rent for all units will be adjusted to reflect current market valuations. New rate, $9,250 per unit. $9,250. For units that had been $1,100 to $1,400 for decades. I read it 3 times. My hands didn't shake. I wouldn't let them. I called my parents that evening. I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table. Same yellow tiles, same ledger open beside me. And I explained what Isabella had done. My father cleared his throat. "Well, Elena, the market is the market. Isabella understands these things better than we do." My mother added, "She's just trying to maximize the building's potential, honey. Don't take it personally." Don't take it personally. My sister had just tried to price 18 families out of their homes. Families who had been paying rent to our grandmother since before Isabella learned to spell acquisition. And my mother's advice was, don't take it personally. I thanked them. I hung up. I set the phone face down on the table and pressed my palm flat against the cool tile. I stayed like that for a long time. Long enough for the tile to stop feeling cold. Long enough for the anger to settle into something quieter and more dangerous. Then I opened the ledger and started writing. The next morning, I walked into the hallway and saw what I'd been trying to protect. Mrs. Alvarez was at the stairwell, one hand clutching the notice, the other gripping the banister like the building itself might tilt. 28 years she'd lived here. 28 years of never missing a payment. And now she was doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to, and couldn't stop doing anyway. Mr. Novak stood in his doorway with his walker and his maintenance log open in his hands. He was muttering numbers under his breath, quietly, the way someone does when they're trying to solve a problem that has no solution on a fixed income. He'd kept this building's lights on for 15 years. Now he was trying to figure out if he had anywhere to go. Down the hall, the Kim family had a cardboard box open on their floor. Jiyeon's winter boots were folded inside. She was asking her mother something in Korean, her voice steady, even though her hands weren't. Her mother couldn't answer. There was no shouting, no chaos. Just a quiet, suffocating weight. The sound of people trying to stay calm, when calm is the only thing they have left. People avoided my gaze. Not out of blame, because hope felt too fragile to say out loud. Sarah Chen was the only one who didn't show fear. She knocked on my office door, sat down across from me, and said, "This rent increase isn't legal. You know that, right?" I knew. "And you know who's behind it." I knew that too. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, the calculations behind her eyes. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I closed the ledger. "I'm going to be very patient." Isabella moved fast. Within a week, she'd scheduled building inspections, her own people, not city officials. 3 men in hard hats who walked through hallways with clipboards, marking things that weren't broken, photographing walls that didn't have cracks. She texted me, "These inspections are standard. Don't interfere." I didn't type back. I just screenshot it. Then I screenshot the next one, and the next. Every text, every email, every voicemail Isabella left. I saved them all in a folder on my laptop labeled Recipes. The inspectors came back twice more. Each time they found violations that didn't exist. A fire escape that had passed city inspection 3 months ago was suddenly structurally compromised. A boiler that Mr. Novak had personally maintained for 15 years was beyond repair. But the building had something Isabella hadn't accounted for. Community. Mrs. Alvarez started documenting everything on her phone. Every inspector who entered, every clipboard, every fake violation. Time-stamped, dated, filed. Mr. Novak pulled out the maintenance records he'd kept since 1998. Handwritten, meticulous. Every repair logged. The Kim family installed a doorbell camera that covered the main entrance. And Sarah Chen, quiet, precise Sarah Chen, started running numbers. Nobody organized this. Nobody gave a speech. They just started protecting what was theirs, the same way my grandmother had protected it, with patience, with records, with quiet, stubborn refusal to leave. Isabella came to the building on a Thursday afternoon. Tailored blazer, new heels. She walked through the lobby like she owned it. She didn't. She met with Mrs. Gable from Unit 9B, the oldest tenant, 83, lived there since 1991. Mrs. Gable had a bad hip and a sharp mind, and a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could read your receipts. I wasn't there for the conversation. But Mrs. Gable told me afterward, sitting in her armchair with a cup of tea balanced on her knee. Your sister offered me $15,000 to leave, called it a relocation package. Very professional, very smooth. She sipped her tea. I told her I'd think about it. Will you? I asked. Mrs. Gable set down her cup and looked at me the way she used to look at my grandmother, like she was measuring something that couldn't be measured in numbers. I've known Isabella since she was 15 years old, she said. I watched her at your grandmother's dinner table. The way she looked at this building, even then, it wasn't the way you looked at it. It was never the same. She paused. Your grandmother noticed too. She worried about it. She worried that ambition, left cold long enough, becomes something else entirely. She looked at me over her glasses. Have you been down to the basement lately, Elena? I hadn't. The basement smelled like dust and old concrete. I hadn't been down there in over a year. It was storage mostly, boxes of my grandmother's things I'd never sorted through. She always said the basement was the heart of the building. Messy, overlooked, holding everything together. I moved slowly, following the memory of afternoons I'd spent helping her sort through holiday decorations, old tools, things she refused to throw away. I scanned every shelf until my fingers found the edge of her old sewing cabinet, a squat little piece she'd never gotten rid of, even after the drawers stopped gliding properly. I shifted it aside. Behind it, a faint crack in the floor. The lines too straight, too deliberate to be ordinary wear. I wedged my fingers under the board and lifted it away. Beneath it sat a weatherproof box, small enough to ignore, heavy enough to matter. Inside, folders wrapped in elastic bands, a stack of sealed envelopes, and a small metal tin. I opened the tin first. A set of keys rested inside, paired with a note in my grandmother's handwriting. Steady, even in her final months. For when the time comes. Not if, when. She had known. All along she had known. I set the note down carefully and opened the first folder. The papers weren't sentimental keepsakes. They were structured, intentional, stamped and notarized. At the top of the first page, the operating agreement for Ross Legacy Holdings. The line naming me as sole member, written without ambiguity. My signature beside hers. She must have guided me through the paperwork one afternoon when I thought I was just helping her with routine management tasks, never realizing she was transferring everything into my hands. I set that folder down and opened the next. Printed emails. Correspondence between Isabella and Urban Horizon Development Partners. Their language was careful, professional, but unmistakable. Projected values, vacancy timelines, potential barriers to redevelopment. People like Mr. Novak and the Kim family reduced to line items. Obstacles on a spreadsheet. The most recent messages outline ways to accelerate turnover. I forced myself to keep reading. I opened the last envelope. A handwritten letter, addressed to me. The ink faded at the edges, the paper curled slightly at the corners, but her voice came through stronger than any document. She wrote about her fear. That the people she trusted wouldn't care for the building the way she had. That ambition would cloud judgment, and compassion would be dismissed as weakness. Then she wrote this. You see people as individuals, not numbers. This matters more than anyone has ever told you. She explained her decision, quietly, without drama, to make sure the building's future wasn't left in the wrong hands. She wrote that she had watched both of us our whole lives, that she loved Isabella, and that she knew, with the certainty of someone who has been watching for a very long time, that I was the one who understood what the building actually was. Not property, a promise. And you already know how to keep it. I sat on the basement floor for a long time. The concrete was cold through my jeans, and I didn't care. Somewhere above me, I could hear Mr. Novak's television through the ceiling. I didn't cry. But I let myself feel the weight of it, the grief, the love, the responsibility, before I stood up. Then I picked up my phone and called Elias Thorne. Elias met me at his office the next morning. Same desk, same leather and coffee smell. He read through every document without speaking. 17 minutes. I counted. When he finished, he took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and said, Your grandmother was smarter than all of us. What do we have? I asked. You have proof of ownership that Isabella doesn't know about. You have evidence of a scheme to defraud tenants and sell property that isn't hers. You have 18 months of documented financial misconduct. He paused. And you have emails that Isabella sent from her own work account. She forwarded the Urban Horizon correspondence to what she thought was her personal email. She mistyped it. The messages went to the building's general account. The one my grandmother set up in 1994, I said. Which forwards to the LLC inbox. Which forwards to you. He almost smiled. She emailed you the evidence herself. She just didn't know it. I went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table. I took out my grandmother's leather binder, the one she kept for special occasions, and I began to organize. The LLC documents, the ownership papers, the bank ledgers showing $47,000 siphoned through dummy invoices, the emails, every piece of evidence in chronological order, separated by labeled tabs. Sarah Chen helped. She came over with her laptop and a bottle of wine and spent 4 hours cross-referencing financial records with a forensic accountant's precision. She found 3 more transactions Isabella had tried to hide. Total, $47,312. She wasn't even good at it, Sarah said quietly. No, she wasn't. The binder was ready in 6 days, 47 pages. Every document copied, highlighted, annotated in my grandmother's leather binder with my grandmother's pen. I called Elias one more time. I need a boardroom, I said, and I need you to bring someone. The boardroom was on the 4th floor of a building Isabella had rented for the occasion. Long oak table, floor-to-ceiling windows. She'd wanted to impress the Urban Horizon people. Instead, it was just us. Isabella sat at one end, blazer buttoned, laptop open. Our parents sat beside her, Dad in his Sunday jacket, Mom with her hands folded like she was at church. Isabella's attorney, a man named Whitfield, had a stack of papers and a confident smile. Elias sat next to me, quiet, glasses clean. And in the corner, a woman I'd never introduced. mid-40s, gray suit, no jewelry. She had a legal pad and a pen, and she hadn't said a word to anyone. Isabella hadn't even asked who she was. That was her first mistake. I set my grandmother's binder on the table. Brown leather, worn at the edges, the brass clasp tarnished from years of use. 47 pages inside. Pabers of Absment and Fields and Pijern or Necessity. Isabella started talking. She had a presentation prepared. Slides about market value, development potential, projected returns. She spoke for 4 minutes about maximizing the asset and transitioning management. She didn't look at me once. When she finished, Whitfield slid a document across the table. "This is a fair offer, Elena. Sign here, and you can walk away with a generous severance." I didn't sign. I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. I just opened the binder and turned the pages. The first tab, Ross Legacy Holdings, LLC. Formation documents dated 2008. My grandmother's handwriting on every page. My name as sole member. Isabella stopped mid-sip of her water. "This building," I said quietly, "has been held in an LLC since before you graduated from Northwestern." Whitfield leaned forward. His confident smile flickered. The woman in the corner stood up. "My name is Karen Marsh," she said. "I'm an investigator with the city attorney's office. I've been reviewing this case for 3 weeks." The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where you can hear someone's breathing change. Isabella looked at Elias, at me, at the binder, at Karen Marsh. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Based on the documentation provided," Karen continued, setting her legal pad on the table, "we're looking at financial misconduct, fraudulent property representation, and potential federal wire fraud charges related to the interstate correspondence with Urban Horizon." Whitfield closed his folder. He didn't look at Isabella. He looked at the door. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Whitfield excused himself. He didn't say he was leaving. He said he needed to make a call. He never came back. Isabella's own attorney walked out of the room and left her sitting there. Our father stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Isabella, what did you do?" It was the first time I'd ever heard him raise his voice at her. Our mother didn't stand. She just sat there, hands refolded, staring at the table. She didn't defend Isabella. She didn't defend anyone. She just went very, very quiet. Isabella turned to me. Her blazer was still buttoned. Her posture was still straight. But her eyes looked like someone who just realized the floor beneath her wasn't there anymore. "Elena," she said, her voice cracked on the second syllable. "Elena, we can talk about this. We're family." The trial lasted 4 months. The courtroom had tall windows and cold air, and the stillness of a place where decisions reshape lives. I sat behind the rail with the binder on my lap, though I no longer needed to open it. Every document, every number, had already settled into my memory with unshakable clarity. The charges were read with clinical precision. Financial misconduct, fraudulent property representation, wire fraud. The prosecutor laid out each piece of evidence calmly. I watched my sister at the defense table, her posture stiff, her eyes forward. She looked smaller than I remembered. The confidence she used to wear so easily had evaporated under the sterile lights. Then the witnesses were called. Mrs. Alvarez spoke about the notice taped to the lobby door, about the fear that moved through the hallways afterward. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did, and she kept them folded in her lap so no one would see. Mr. Novak was called next. He made his way to the stand slowly, both hands on his walker. He recounted the inspectors who appeared in hard hats, marking violations that didn't exist. The boiler he'd maintained for 15 years, declared beyond repair. He spoke without anger, just exhaustion. The kind that accumulates when someone treats stability as something disposable. The Kim family described the morning Jiyeon asked why she had to leave her school. Their voices filled that courtroom with something that had no legal name. Not outrage, not accusation, just the weight of ordinary people who had asked for nothing except to be left in peace, and had been used as leverage instead. I was called last. The judge asked direct questions about my role, the documents, the structure my grandmother had put in place. I answered steadily. When I spoke her name aloud in that space, Rose Wynne, it felt like placing a steadying hand on my own shoulder. When the arguments concluded, the verdict came with measured firmness. Guilty on all counts. Isabella was sentenced to a term in state custody, with financial restitution totaling $47,312 and a permanent ban from real estate transactions in the state of Illinois. The judge noted the deliberate nature of the scheme and the impact on vulnerable tenants. There was no outburst, no dramatic plea, just a quiet collapse in her expression, a recognition that the path she had chosen had ended exactly where it was always going to lead. Elias called me that evening. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of me, running my finger along the spine the way she used to. "I know," I said. My parents came to the building 3 weeks after the verdict. They stood in the lobby, Dad in his Sunday jacket, Mom carrying a casserole dish. They wanted to talk, to explain, to say they hadn't known, that they were sorry, that they'd been wrong about Isabella, about all of it. I saw them through the office window, standing there with that casserole, looking at the tile floors my grandmother had chosen in 1987. I didn't forgive them that day. I didn't punish them either. I walked through the lobby, past the mailboxes, past them, and out the front door into the October air. I didn't look back. I didn't need the last word. Some reckonings don't need a conversation. They just need time. The building is still standing. Same 18 units. Same Southside address. Mrs. Alvarez's orchid survived another winter. She brought me empanadas last Tuesday and stayed for an hour to talk about her granddaughter's quinceañera. Mr. Novak fixed the hallway lights again. He whistled while he worked. He hadn't whistled in months. Ji-yeon Kim started her second year at DePaul. She sent me a card, handwritten on cream paper, that said, "Thank you for keeping the promise." I put it in the ledger between December and January. Sarah Chen still lives in Unit 3A. She still pays on time. She still never asks for anything. But sometimes, on Friday evenings, she knocks on my door with a bottle of wine, and we sit at the kitchen table and don't talk about anything important at all. That's enough. That's more than enough. If this story taught me anything, it's this. Family is not a free pass. Shared blood does not entitle anyone to your silence, your savings, or your grandmother's promise. Love can be a reason to protect. It should never be a reason to surrender. And the quietest person in the room is not always the weakest. Sometimes she's the one who's been keeping the ledger. I still think about that boardroom, about Isabella's face when she realized the floor wasn't there, about my parents in the lobby with that casserole, about a note in a tin box that said, "For when the time comes," written by a woman who never doubted, not once, that I was the one who would come. I didn't fight my sister. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need the last word. I just opened a binder and let my grandmother's handwriting speak for both of us. And that's a Godi begins the first. Maybe you know someone like Elena, someone who keeps the records, someone who fixes what's broken and never mentions it, someone who shows up early and stays late and somehow still gets the seat by the kitchen door. Or maybe you are that person. If you are, keep the ledger. Because quiet power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a stage. It just holds. Year after year. Ledger page after ledger page. until the day someone tries to take what it built and discovers it can't be moved.